I believe that I plant seeds. I never see the finished product of the children that I teach. I'm part of their enlightenment. I'm not all of it. There are wrongs, but there's more than one right. And it's teaching children how to distinguish between those things. And so we teach them how to make judgments on moral issues. How do you decide what is right and wrong? How do you decide what a strong or a weak argument is? And actually giving them those skills, giving them that framework allows them to think for themselves, not being told what to think.
Good afternoon, Louisa. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. Well, it's such a pleasure to talk to you again. You may have seen it on Twitter, but I sort of pre-announced you as I think you might be my most important guest ever out of the 200 or so I've done so far, because you're not just teaching the new generations about worldviews and religion, you're also helping teach the teachers too. So your power and influence spread far and wide. So it's great to get the chance to talk to you.
I mean, let's wait for that sort of judgment until the end and see how good my answers are. So we'll see.
That seems fair.
But, it's such a privilege to be part of spending time with the next generation and thinking about how they work and what's important to them and what they value. And I think, my experiences are they're the most enlightened generation. They're just incredible. I compare myself to, when I was 13, 14, 15, my world is very small and I just kind of thought about me. And actually they're so socially aware and they're so aware of, for better or worse, the bigger picture. And they're so passionate about things that really matter. So it's a real privilege.
Yeah. And I'm so lucky because I do some workshops and so on in schools, but I just get to do the fun bit. So I don't have to do the lesson planning or the prep or the marking or the discipline or the admin or the meetings. I just get to do the fun bit with the classes. But I just echo that. It just sort of restores my hope in humanity. Working with young people is amazing. But at the same time, it's, the work you and your colleagues do is deeply challenging because you're on the front lines of some of the most important and most contentious topics in modern society and dealing with kids in quite often sensitive situations too. So, enormous respect to you and the people in your field, as we'll dig into today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And I need to thank the lovely Carenza Passmore for suggesting I reach out to you in the first place.
Oh, yes.
And I've been lucky enough to be on your podcast, obviously. It hasn't been published yet, so people can judge that when it comes out. So it's great to turn the tables. And you know this already, but this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest and most important philosophical questions. And those include questions about epistemology, what's real and how should we best understand this crazy universe we all share, but just as importantly, the questions of ethics and who matters. And I have an obvious bias because the worldview I'm trying to develop and popularize, as you know, is the same name as this podcast and YouTube series, Sentientism. And I summarize it as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So when it's answering that what's real question, it says, let's, with a healthy dose of humility, take a naturalistic approach that uses evidence and reason to try and understand things as well as we can, engage honestly with reality in a desperate attempt to try and get our heads around it. And on the ethical side, it's very pluralistic, but it does insist that every sentient being, at least every being that can feel, has the capacity to have experiences, should be included seriously in our moral consideration. But I'm talking to people regardless of whether they agree or disagree with that worldview. So it'd be interesting to dig into your own philosophical journey around those big questions and how that plays through your work today, given you're teaching people about exactly those deep questions and much more besides.
And what's lovely, actually, is that I very rarely get asked those questions. And I very rarely get the opportunity to talk about my own opinion because that's not what good RE teachers do, particularly. They might select certain times when that might be appropriate, but generally we're asking them and we're trying to give a balanced view and what other people think. So actually it's really lovely to have the opportunity to be asked those big questions, because actually the reason we love RE is because we love those big questions. That's the thing that motivates us and drives us. So this is like a proper geek out for me. So thank you so much.
Good. It's a pleasure. And it must be, I'd imagine that must also be a little bit frustrating sometimes, because I understand you want to maintain that professionalism and a sense of neutrality and an ability to engage with lots of different viewpoints in an open, constructive way. But at the same time, you've got your own views in your head that are bubbling away there that you're sort of desperate to express and share. And yeah.
And I often have to sort of compartmentalize me as a human being with my own thoughts and feelings and me as a teacher that has to present, an unbiased, objective reality of the variety of worldviews that we teach about. And some days I just simply don't, just in the choice of language, I think we all have subconscious bias anyway, and it's almost impossible to do that. But I do have to sometimes distance myself from the topic if it's something I feel very passionate about and I have very strong opinions about the opinions of others. I do have to just kind of take that moment and go, right, this is not my therapy session.
Yeah, exactly. Well, before we get into those deep philosophical questions and geek out together, we've already hinted a little bit at your introduction, but how would you best introduce yourself for people who don't know of your work?
Yes. So for the last 22 years, I've been an RE teacher in secondary school in the UK. In October 2020, as many people did, they got their little lockdown project. And actually for a while, I'd been wanting to do something creative. I just think teachers are so talented and so knowledgeable, and they do great things in the classroom, but those skills are often transferable. And I had this real need to do something creative, and I started books and tried to organise a roadshow, and nothing happened. And then in October 2020, I started the RE podcast, which is the first dedicated podcast for students and teachers of RE, with no idea what a podcast was and no idea how to do one. So it was a very sort of steep learning curve. But actually, the RE community is so gracious and so generous. They've been so supportive, that actually now 2024, I'm sort of nearing 4 years of doing this, and it's just absolutely wonderful. I absolutely love it. So they're my two sort of main raison d'etres.
And I think most of my audience, we have a fairly global audience, but I think most people have picked up what RE is, but it's essentially religious education.
Yeah, and actually it's something that's fairly unique, I think, to British schools. They don't have it in quite the same way in other countries, but actually here in the UK, it's a national entitlement. So every child up to the age of 18 should be receiving some kind of religious education. And obviously there's been different incarnations of that from the beginning, where it was very much, religious instruction, whereby you taught people how to be a good Christian person, to now where we're really moving into looking at religion and worldviews and actually really broadening that idea that everybody in the world has a worldview. We all stand somewhere. And how best do we navigate all those varieties of opinions and show respect and tolerance and compassion for people who think differently? And that will include, religious and non-religious worldviews. Modern life today means you have your fingers in a lot of pies. So I teach, I do the podcast. I'm a member of NATRE, which is the National Association of Teachers of RE, and I'm on the executive for that. And I'm also working for Oak National, which is a sort of online teaching platform that was started during lockdown to support teachers in teaching online, and now is kind of growing in strength to really supporting RE teachers. So in my spare time, I do that.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like you have any spare time. That's one of the things that's blown my mind about, as I've been learning about the religion and worldviews education space in the UK and just meeting more people, is everyone seems to have 5 or 6 different jobs. I don't quite know how you do it. Teaching is insane as it is, just as a day job, let alone everything else. But
I think we're just generally, we love opportunities. We like life. We're very, we've got a lot of energy. We've got a lot of experience, a lot of talent. And I think that actually the nature of teaching is you get introduced to lots of different people with lots of different ideas and lots of different opportunities. So, yeah. And I think, the reality is teaching, as you say, is not the easiest job in the world. And I think a lot of us need to have sort of a focus that takes us out of that teaching mindset, because it can kind of take over your life a little bit. You could be marking, planning, every hour of every day. So it's really important to have those kind of other focuses for your own well-being, I think.
Yeah, sounds good. And occasionally to talk about your own opinions, which is what we do now. So let's come on to the first of these crazily broad questions. And I, in common sense terms, describe it as what's real. And in a way, I've shifted over time from focusing on the sort of ontological question of, do supernatural things exist, or is the natural world all that's there, more to focus on the toolkit we use, the epistemology, how do we go about working this stuff out? But it's such a broad topic because it can cover every field of human knowledge, belief, and credences. But quite often an interesting way, given your background and your current work into the topic, is to understand people's journey with respect to religion and the supernatural and naturalistic worldviews or spirituality, and how that's changed over their life, even since childhood. And how do you think about those deep, big questions of the nature of reality and how best to understand it now? So I don't know, you can wind the clock back as far as you like to tell us the story about, what sort of context you grew up in and what your journey's been so far on that.
Yeah. So I was brought up in a family where my mum was Catholic, my dad was an atheist. And so for the first 7 or 8 years of my life, I went to a Catholic school, I went to a Catholic church, I was brought up as a Catholic, I did my Holy Communion, I was christened as a baby. I had this kind of very Catholic religious upbringing. And so my worldview at that point was very much shaped like that. You just accept the reality that you are given by your caretakers. And that was then reinforced at school, because I went to a Catholic school, reinforced at church with the priest, reinforced with my friends, because all my friends were Catholics as well. But what was interesting is having a dad who was an atheist. But at no point did I really consider that atheism was a valid worldview. I didn't think about it. I was 8 years old. But I do remember at sort of 8 years old, my dad had this big conversion to Christianity, from being a complete and utter atheist and hating religion to becoming quite an evangelical Christian. And so he started going to a Protestant church.
And how did that come about for him, if it's not too much of a tangent?
He had a big religious experience.
Oh, yeah.
It was kind of a Saul on Damascus Road type thing, where his sister was sort of evangelical Christian and kept sort of talking to him about religion, and eventually took him to some kind of men's prayer breakfast. And my dad just thought it was terrible and spent the whole time going home going, this is rubbish. If I was a Christian, I would do it like this, this and this, and they should do that and they shouldn't do this. And then he heard a voice saying, do it then. And by this time he'd got home and he got pushed. He felt a sort of pressure pushing him onto the bed, and he couldn't move. And he felt 3 waves of energy go through him, which he subsequently thought was God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And so that was this quite dramatic experience. And so that version of Christianity was so very different from my Catholic version that it was quite exciting. So I ended up going to church with my dad. And so therefore I then had, this other worldview, but it was still, there is a God and God created everything, and, everything, the Bible is real and everything it says it's real.
And what sort of response did you get from Catholic friends and from your mother and the rest of the community given that default? Was that a difficult transition, or was it quite an easy switch? Yeah.
Not at all. And actually ended up that my whole family sort of left the Catholic Church and went to the Protestant Church. I think my mum had been brought up a Catholic, so that was the denomination that she was connected to, but actually saw what had happened to my dad and started going to a sort of Protestant church. And there was much more, as I was sort of becoming older, 9, 10, 11, there was much more for my age group in the Protestant church in terms of youth work and things like that. So we actually sort of transitioned over to that. And up until I was probably 18 or 19, that was my worldview. And it was quite fundamentalist. That the church that my dad went to was, an evangelical church. And there was very clear sort of guidelines and belief systems and morality and what's right and what's wrong and what's real and what isn't, to the point of it being quite judgmental, I think. And I think at university was the first time I really questioned anything. So I think it was the first time I'd been taken out of my little religious bubble that I was in and exposed to ideas, alternative ideas to sort of the religious worldview. And actually, a lot of the things I've been told just didn't hold up to scrutiny, to that sort of critical realism that you want to kind of assess ideas with. Particularly, I think, sort of the idea of the evil and why there's evil and suffering. I just didn't feel that was an answer. There was no answer that satisfied that question, that problem. And I think particularly views about who was in and who was out, that sort of exclusivity that some Christian denominations have, that there was the only way to God is through Jesus and everyone else is going to hell, that I found very problematic. Attitudes towards homosexuality I found very problematic. And actually that sort of helped me to reevaluate my own belief system, and I ended up rejecting everything. So I think that often happens is if you're very much in something, if something falls apart, it all falls apart. And I think this is why some people are very hesitant to question their faith in case it all falls apart.
Yeah, there's a worry that it's a bit brittle, and if a crack appears, the whole thing goes. And
Yes. So you don't ask questions, you just accept. And there's, this idea of blind faith is something that is celebrated in some sort of versions of Christianity.
Yeah, it's almost a mark of pride that you sort of double down on it without questioning. It's a sign of your commitment, right? So,
100%. And actually, I'm a naturally inquisitive, curious, cynical, questioning person. So as soon as I was given that opportunity, I kind of, found that actually Christian faith didn't sit right with me. This looking at other alternatives, I suddenly thought, actually, I don't like the idea of people going to hell. I don't like the idea that homosexuality is wrong. I don't think if there was a God, this is the world that we would see. And so I became an atheist for a long period of time.
It feels like there was a very strong moral theme to your challenges there. Like you say, the problem of evil and the problem of suffering, the immorality of sending billions to hell, and things like homophobia. And I don't know if there were some other issues as well. Often things like sexism and various types of anti-worldview bigotry pop up and so on. And for many of my guests, that's the same. It's actually a sort of moral thing where they're going, hold on, I've been given this set of moral guidelines that just don't sit with my moral intuitions and what I think is right and wrong. So that's where the challenge comes from and the cracks appear. With others, it's more of a technical fact and evidence and reason thing. It's more of a sort of, atheist argument of, I've looked at the evidence and it just doesn't seem to stack up. These things don't feel true to me, or they feel very unlikely. Was it more of a moral thing, or was it a bit of both? Was it also just I don't see the evidence more at that point?
I think, there was a sort of running alongside this was that I didn't seem to get the same thing from Christianity that everyone else got. I didn't get that peace. I didn't get that joy. I didn't feel God's presence. I didn't see answered prayer. Personally, I saw it around me, but not me. So actually there was this personal evidence, this personal experience thing that I also didn't have. So I think there's the moral side of things that actually I feel that this doesn't sit morally with me and what I believe is right. But I think there's also that sort of experience of, or lack of experience, lack of evidence in the things that I was believing. I just didn't feel peace or love or joy or any of these things that Christianity is meant to give you and God is meant to give you.
And what did that transition feel like? Again, because for some people, it's really easy and it's just a natural switch and off they go. For other people, it's quite a psychologically difficult thing for them to cope with. It leaves a gap or some really challenging unanswered questions or a sense of uncertainty. For others, it's a social challenge, particularly, as you were saying, it's very important to your family. So what did that transition feel like to you at that point?
I mean, I think every single part of it was difficult. So it was difficult because I got rejected from my church. I was no longer a part of the church because I didn't.
And was that an active rejection?
Yeah. So I stopped going to church, but actually the friends that I had at church then stopped inviting me to things because I'd backslidden. And I think emotionally it was incredibly tough. And I think that's the moment I suffered quite badly with it, depression and anxiety and insomnia. That's when that started, because everything I'd built my life on, everything that I thought was safe and secure and firm had suddenly been taken away. And it was incredibly difficult for my family. And it still is incredibly difficult for my family. But at the same time, it was exciting enough that I carried on. I was still true to myself. I think that what was interesting is that now I look back and I think that atheism is the flip side of theism. You need just as much faith to be an atheist as to be a theist. And so actually atheism for me didn't last very long, because I was saying I kind of came to the realization that the only true scientific, reasonable conclusion is that we don't know. There is no evidence either way. And I would say that I don't believe there is a God, but I don't believe there's not a God. I don't think there's enough evidence either way. I do think, however, that our understanding of God, if there is a God, is incredibly limited to a religious version of that God. And so I kind of now would say I'm an agnostic, because I think Huxley, who coined the phrase agnostic, which means not knowing, it's not that I don't know, it's that it's not possible to know scientifically, empirically, whether or not God exists. So the only true scientific position has to be agnosticism, which is kind of where I've ended up.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm reasonably comfortable with the term atheist because I might describe myself as a sort of fairly extreme agnostic. So I'd agree with you. I think I'm in a state of not knowing, but my sense of the evidence is quite strongly one way rather than the other. So that's where I wouldn't say, 100% or 0%. I wouldn't even use the word belief or not belief so much, except in a sort of offhanded sort of way. But if I think about credences or degrees of confidence, I'm pretty confident there isn't a God, but I wouldn't put that at 0. So, in that sense, I'm an agnostic too.
Yeah. So you have there's something called an atheistic agnostic, which is you're an agnostic, but you're leaning towards atheism. And I think I would sit there if we were talking about theism as a belief in the Abrahamic God. Then I probably would. I don't believe in that God. I don't believe in the God of the Old Testament or the God of the New Testament or the God of Christianity. Why I'm not an atheist is because I cannot rule out that there's not something that is some kind of ultimate higher power that is greater than ourselves. But I think if that thing does exist, it's so different from our human understanding of it.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's a really important distinction that's often missed because there is a traditional sort of path to becoming an atheist, which is, you're brought up in one religion and then you reject that religion. That takes you to atheism because of a rejection of one specific religion, but rejecting the beliefs and the tenets and the facts and evidence and the moral systems of one particular religion is not the same as rejecting theism as a broader philosophical concept, which can be much more amorphous and much more, much less strictly defined, right? So I think there are many people who've moved away from a religious worldview who would still have some degree of credence in theism as a concept, but they have the humility not to say, and I know exactly what the characteristics of that God are and what they want us to do, and here's the 10 Commandments, right? There's a
100%.
big difference between those two stances. Thank you. And again, to draw this distinction between the sort of ontology of is there a God or not, and the epistemology, what do you think about those different modes of knowing? Because again, with this sentientism idea, I tend to focus more on a naturalistic epistemology that's using evidence and reason as distinct from other modes of knowing, which might include faith or fideism or revelation. Although you could say revelation is a type of evidence in a way, right? Your personal experience is still a type of evidence. That's still evidence. Or a dogmatic belief which doesn't change based on the evidence, or an unquestioning following of an authority figure, whether or not they have the evidence to support them. So if you think about a sort of naturalistic approach, defining using evidence and reason in its broadest terms, this isn't just sort of narrow science and doing randomized control trials. This is evidence including personal experience. Versus those other types of worldviews, would you say your way of thinking is naturalistic, such that if you were to shift your view on religion or theism, it would be because of evidence and reasoning? Or do you think there is some valid space for a genuine faith that is independent from evidence?
It's really interesting. I think as I get older, I'm less black and white about things. I'm very inspired by Buddhism that actually take this middle way. I actually think it doesn't matter. And let me explain why I think that. I'm always up for the impact of the belief, not the reason for it. So if a belief in a higher being brings purpose and meaning to your life, then it's real because of that experience. It doesn't matter whether God actually exists. I don't think that's the right question when we think about God. If we're talking about what is real, a belief in God is real. And if that belief in God has a positive impact on an individual, a community, a society, a world, then that is real because the belief is real. And so I spend an awful lot of time thinking about this, talking about it, talking to people. And actually, this is my worldview, that I don't mind what is real and what is not. What I mind is the consequences of that. And so if your belief in God causes suffering, so if you are taking away someone's rights because of your belief is wrong, regardless of whether it's real. And so actually, I know people who, believe in God, and the value and positivity and joy and peace and purpose it gives to them is so beautiful. I never want to ask the question about whether their belief is real or not. For me, belief in God was not positive at all. And I know people that use their belief in God to cause suffering to others. That for me is problematic, regardless of whether it's real. So for me, does God exist? How do we know things? I think is the wrong question.
Thank you. That's fascinating. So in a way, quite often people will think of epistemology and even ontology as distinct things that aren't related to morality. They're just technically about how well are we understanding reality? Or are we right? Are we wrong? Or is our confidence well aligned with reality? Whereas your stance is deliberately almost driving your epistemology and your ontology by a moral view, by saying, actually, what's more important is the outcomes and the impacts and the results of these in moral terms, almost regardless of the ontology and the epistemology.
And also, I think the reality is that we are all influenced by all of those things. We're all influenced by our reason. We're all influenced by our experience. We're all influenced by our upbringing. All of those things create our worldview, create what is real for us, create our own truth. To a more or less extent, we might have, like, if it was a sort of pie chart, everybody's pie chart would have different numbers of segments in terms of what influences what they believe. That I don't think you can't put humans into boxes, and I don't think you can put knowledge into boxes, and I don't think you can judge ways of knowing and say this one is a more valid way of knowing than this. Because I think actually we're all a product of all of those ways of knowing. We are a product of our experience. We are a product of how we've been taught how to reason, and that's very culturally specific.
And I'd suggest that recognizing that and understanding that is part of a broadly naturalistic worldview, right? You have to have that understanding too. Otherwise you've fallen into your own sort of dogma. But yeah.
And I think, yeah, exactly. And I think that's what I came out of a very dogmatic worldview. I don't want to move into another one. And so I tend to kind of sit above everything. And, the reality is I'm a little magpie and I just take all the little shiny bits from all the different things. And I see value in all of them in terms of the impact that they have on people.
Yeah, thank you. And so it feels like, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but my guess is that broadly your default epistemology is naturalistic and that you'd use evidence and reason to try and work out, what's real and what isn't. But you're not going to use that to, crush someone's beliefs if they have a positive impact on them by insisting that they've got it all wrong. Just as one example, right? So you're not going to let that epistemological confidence that you might have, drive roughshod over moral stances. And I guess it probably works the other way around as well, in that while you might have a open-minded appreciation for all sorts of different positionalities and worldviews and ways of knowing, if those ways of knowing happen to cause harm, you'll also be quite comfortable, robustly standing up to those, whatever 100%. The basis is. Yeah. So again, it's a moral drive for the epistemology, which again, although sometimes it's set as distinct from morality, I think often that is an artificial distinction because, yes, you might say that there's some narrow technical, intellectual interest in just understanding things accurately. But why do you want to understand things accurately? And ultimately, maybe there's a deeper reason, which is, well, because we want to have an impact on the world, a positive moral impact on the world, right? That's ultimately why we want to understand it well. So even there, I think it's very hard to, extract a morality from epistemology and ways of knowing, and arguably it can be dangerous too. So yeah, thank you for that.
Always, there's this beautiful story that's, I don't know where it originated, but it's a sort of from Indian culture. And there's a very long version, but the short version is there is an elephant and there are 3 blind men. And they have all heard an elephant, they've heard what it can do, but they're not able to see one. And so this elephant is in front of them and they all hold the elephant in different parts of the elephant. And they start to argue about what the elephant is. And the reality is the elephant is all of those things. They're like, no, it's like a stake. And the other one's it's like a tree trunk. It's like, whatever. It's like a piece of rope. The elephant is all of those things and much greater. And I think what we have in human history is people trying to make sense of the world around them. And too many humans throughout history have come to this idea of an ultimate being. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there is something about the human experience that points towards some kind of higher being. I think the problem is when we try to say that one person's view of the higher being is more valid than another, when actually I think if there is such a thing, it's all of those things and more. So there is both one God and many gods and no gods. All of those reality, if we're talking about truth, I think the truth is much bigger than any one of our ideas. It's bigger than epistemology, it's bigger than ontology, it's bigger than fideism, it's bigger than experience. If there is some kind of ultimate being, and, I find it a weird coincidence that groups of people from ancient cultures that had never, ever met came to similar conclusions about what is real and ultimate, beings and afterlives, because of them making sense of their experiences on Earth, that I have to be open to the fact that there's something greater. I also, if I'm talking about cosmology, I'm 100% okay understanding that the world began, or the universe began with the Big Bang. I completely understand that. How the Big Bang happened from nothing, I don't know, and science doesn't know. There's theories. So I just think there's little spaces where we just don't know. And, I don't want to have a sort of God of the gaps theory where if we don't know something scientifically, it must be God. That would be naive. But I just think we have to understand the limitations of human knowledge and human experience. And the truth is far greater than that.
Yeah, completely. And that answer, I don't know, I think and we talked about this when you turn the tables on me or vice versa, is I think one of the best naturalistic answers, right? If someone says, I don't know, but, I'm curious, let's try and find out. That's a good naturalistic answer. Making up an answer isn't such a good response. And again, going back to your previous conversation, your sense that so many different groups of humans have come to this sense that there must be some sort of ultimate being, that can even broaden out to a sense of God as nature or God as the universe, where it's not really a being or a consciousness, it's just another way of describing physical reality. And there you can almost get a bit of blurring between a theism and a naturalistic ontology, where it almost just becomes a different way of describing the natural world too. Yeah.
And actually, I'm reading a book at the moment about hallucinogenic drugs, what are they called? Psychedelics. And it's a book by Dr. David Nutt, who's one of the sort of leading experts on this. And if you, people that take things like psilocybin or DMT and have experiences, they experience the universe as a whole and their part in it. And so actually they have what is commonly seen as a religious experience. It's just their narrative around it is different. If a Christian takes, DMT or psilocybin or some kind of psychedelic drug, they will narrate that same experience with the language of God. And so I think that when you feel connected to the universe, you are connected to something greater than itself. And some people call that God. But if you're an atheist, you have to find different language to describe that same experience. But I think we can have experiences that are transcendent without there needing to be a God that's limited within a religion.
Yeah, I agree. And I think my sense is that the reason so many different radically diverse human communities over time and cultures and regions so common to come up with that sense is something more to do with our evolved psychology and agency detection and so on. That's probably where the commonality comes from. Again, because I'm a boring, straight down the line naturalist, right, as you said, right? So, but regardless, I still think even with my completely naturalistic understanding of the world, or 99.5%, naturalistic ontology, I can still feel that sense of transcendence and connection and wonder and awe that I think is very rich to a religious experience as well. And again, I might use different words to describe it. I probably wouldn't put a sort of human style consciousness into whatever that thing is. I would think of it as the universal nature and the operation of the laws of physics and so on. But that same sense of wonder and amazingness is still consistent. We draw clean lines sometimes when there's a lot more fuzziness and overlap. And one of the reasons I really like the elephant analogy is because one of the challenges with, if we're really open-minded about ways of knowing, there's a danger that we lose a connection with the reality we share. And you can almost get to the point where anyone can make up anything. I could just make up an arbitrary belief now, and you would have to accord that respect and so on. Whereas with the elephant story, the three men have a radically different perspective on what this thing is, but there is actually an elephant there, right? Ultimately, if they compare notes and they keep doing research and they keep working on it, they probably can converge on an understanding of their shared reality that enables them to collaborate and cooperate and work together, as opposed to us being sort of separate bubbles of arbitrary beliefs that we connect.
Yeah. And I love the idea that seemingly contradictory beliefs can both be right at the same time. And there's a phrase I use a lot, which is there are wrongs, but there's more than one right.
Yeah. I like it. Well, let's come on to the second crazily big question, which is about ethics and what matters. And it's often interesting to explore with someone like yourself who's gone from a sort of quite deeply religious worldview, and in some senses, as you were saying, quite a fundamentalist one, and quite structured and quite strict about morality, to one that is more broadly naturalistic, agnostic, because with the religious worldviews, they often come with a package of morals, and that can be both a sort of divine command theory structure that says ultimately morality is about following the rules and, echoing the instantiation of the perfect good that is the deity, right? That's the ultimate point. It's not about compassion or kindness or caring or justice. It's about because God says, right? So that's one style. But quite often you can also get a lot of specific rules that come in the commandments or the books or the stories that come along as well. So it would be interesting to explore one, as you were growing up in that Catholic context and then an evangelical Protestant context, how much those did actually shape your moral views about what really mattered at the root of it all. And then as you went through that transition and those challenges and you left those worldviews, was it like releasing an underlying moral intuition that you always had? Or did you feel like you had to rebuild your morality? And that's an insanely long question to ask.
It's okay. I've got it all in my head.
Hopefully get a sense of, that moral journey about what matters and where have you got to now as well?
And I think the first thing I want to say is that I am so thankful for having a religious upbringing. I think it was a very good grounding in thinking about morality and as a concept. And I think, and actually it was done in a very nice structure that was easy. And much of what I was taught, I have continued believing in terms of, you treat others the way you want to be treated, you love your neighbor, this kind of kindness.
That kindness and that golden rule and that consideration for others is something that's so rich and echoes through most, if not all, religious worldviews. Did you get a sense in both the Catholic context and the Protestant context that was the root?
100% not.
Or is that partly what you're coming to next?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
So no, as a growing up as a Christian, if God said it was right. And so I later learn about the Euthyphro debate. Is it good because God says it, or did God say it because it's good? And actually, the Christian church, as I was introduced to it, it's good because God said it. And therefore, if God said it, it must be good.
And by extension, whatever God tells you, good. Whatever it is, right?
Yeah. Later on, I had to work through that. And I was like, okay, there are lots of things that God says, and I'm doing sort of air quotes because that's all about interpretation and what you pick and choose and take out of context or whatever.
The powerful men who've shaped these narratives
absolutely
over hundreds, thousands of years.
Absolutely. So the morality of the church that I experienced, the sort of evangelical church, I had to get rid of all of that because it was actually very damaging to me. And it took a long time to unpick. That root went very, very deep into who I thought I was and how I treated other people. There was a huge amount of judgment on people's lifestyle choices. There was a huge amount about going to hell and punishment and, if you didn't believe the right version of Christianity and, things like that. And so I had to kind of strip away everything and go, right, what are my core fundamental beliefs? What am I still okay with? And I think, through a lot of teaching lessons, a lot of research, a lot of conversations, I've had to rebuild my morality back up again. And I think it's almost teleological, I think, my morality, in that I'm looking at the end or purpose. I'm looking at what is it I want to achieve and what's the best way of getting there. And I think, a very, very crude naturalistic approach would be about survival. That actually we are animals and we are part of an evolutionary system and we have to survive. What allows us to do that? So if I think about killing, is it right or wrong? Well, actually, it can't be right because that is counter to our survival. But can it be right? Sometimes, yes, if the end or purpose of that is to protect life. So, for example, we go to war with people like Hitler because Hitler's trying to kill lots of people and overtake people and get rid of the Jew, blah, blah, blah. That actually we have to protect life and therefore it's sometimes right to kill, in the same way that a lion will kill, a buffalo or whatever. Do lions eat buffaloes? I don't know. I'm not very good at geography. In order to feed the young so that they can survive. But they won't kill a whole herd, and they will eat everything from the animal. So I do feel sometimes, and I think, we've obviously talked about Sentientism, we've talked about veganism. I don't eat meat because I don't need that to survive. There's no end or purpose. I don't need it. But if it was a choice between eating meat or dying, I would eat meat because actually, fundamentally, I'm an animal and I need to survive. So I think that's the sort of crude version of my morality. But I think I've also got the sort of soft, romantic, fluffy, I want everyone to be happy and I don't want people to suffer. And so therefore, that's kind of runs alongside that it's not just about surviving, it's about living, and it's about living so that everyone can flourish. Everything can flourish. And because the natural world is so interconnected, that every living thing that flourishes adds to my own flourishing as a human, and if that's my species.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's probably the core of my morality.
The way I tend to think of those two stances, the former one, the sort of evolutionary survival thing, I tend to think of as quite a good description of how our morality has evolved and even how non-human animal morality evolved, because nature itself is amoral and brutal and evolution is a horrific process where nearly everything dies, quite a lot of it horribly, right? So I don't think it's a good moral guide, but it's useful context for understanding descriptively how it's come to happen, that we feel things like compassion for each other and a mother cares for their child and so on. It's a good description of how that path has developed, because while we've developed some brutal aggression, right, which also has an evolutionary path, right, because it's not about survival of everybody, it's about survival of my genes. That's what really matters. So that can lead to some horrific brutality. It has also led to the fact that cooperation can be evolutionary adaptive as well. So it's not all bad, but there's good and bad, but it's quite an amoral stance that's useful descriptively. Whereas for me, morality in a way is almost a deliberate stepping away from that, as you were then talking about with the sort of fluffy kindness flourishing thing, because in a way that, to my mind, that morality is a deliberate stance of saying, regardless of descriptively how we might have evolved and what it takes to survive, what should matter to us in an ethical sense. And that, with me as well, leads to something that is about a concern for others and wanting others to flourish and seeing the suffering of others as a bad thing, almost regardless of whether it's going to help the propagation of my genes. Because that, if we use that naturalistic stance to drive our behavior, it can take you to some pretty weird places. Like I should beat down the sperm bank every other day. and it leads you to some other also extremely nasty places too. So I quite like to draw that distinction between a descriptive historical context, which is more about evolution, and then a deliberately moral stance, which is grounded in compassion and caring and thinking about how others see things.
I don't think we should ever use nature to justify human behavior. And I think, I've seen it in lots of different ways. So I've seen arguments where people have gone, homosexuality is okay because some animals have same-sex sexual relations. I'm like, hang on. let's not do what animals do, because animals eat their young, and animals.
Yeah, there's rape, infanticide.
All this kind of stuff. That is not
all
our
sorts
moral
of brutality.
compass.
Yeah.
That's not our moral compass. But I think it's the end or purpose of survival and flourishing that benefit, that motivates my morality. And so, if I have a look at homosexuality, my moral stance has to be, if I say this is wrong, it causes suffering. If I say that it's right, it doesn't. No human suffering comes from allowing people to express their sexuality in the way that is natural to them. Nothing. A lot of suffering comes from sex that is not consensual. So therefore, there are very strict rules about sexuality, and it's always down to suffering. Homosexuality does not cause suffering, whereas actually non-consensual sex does. It therefore doesn't matter what gender, what number of people have sex, as long as everyone is consenting and everyone is free to do that, and it's not adultery or anything like that. And so every time I think about what do I believe is right or wrong, it always comes down to survival, flourishing, and not causing suffering.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think that stance of caring about the suffering and flourishing of others as a sort of consequence, as an outcome, I think would echo with many people's intuitive sense of morality, regardless of their worldview. Like I say, it runs richly through many religious worldviews and supernatural worldviews. It runs through humanism. It runs through sentientism as well. But there's a really interesting subsequent question, which we'll come on to now, which is who matters? Because there are some humans who would have that rich sense of compassion and caring about suffering and flourishing only for their in-group of humans. And if you're in an out-group of humans, I'm sorry, but brutality ensues, right? We know the problems that causes, whether that's explicit sort of neo-fascist exclusion, or whether it's forms of discrimination on caste or gender or sexuality or whatever it might be, looks, right? So there's problems even within our human species about in-groups and out-groups that you touched on before. There's also a deep challenge that obviously sentientism is speaking to, which is that many people would agree with us and tick all the boxes, but they would only go so far as the human species and would say, I'm on board with universal human rights and compassion for all humans, but that's basically where it stops. And even they would make some exceptions, for a companion animal or a couple of charismatic wildlife, but they wouldn't go beyond that. So that's another story I'd be interested in, is what's your journey been on that moral scope question about who gets to count, both within humanity, as you work through some of the moral challenges of the shifts in your worldview, but also how do you think about non-human animals, or maybe even broader than that, as we look out to environment, as to thinking about who matters in our moral considerations. When you're thinking about the consequences and the outcomes and the suffering and the flourishing, who gets to be, thought about, who gets to be in the spreadsheet? Not that you have a spreadsheet.
Yeah. My spreadsheet's very long. There are many pages, many cells. The reality is that humans can suffer, animals can suffer, nature can suffer. So all of those have to be taken into consideration. If I pollute the atmosphere, then it suffers. If we have acid rain, if we have dead zones in our seas, if we have oil spills, whatever it is, it creates suffering. So if something can suffer, it needs moral consideration.
And is your sense that, because I think polluting the atmosphere is bad, and I think polluting a river is bad, but I don't think the atmosphere or the river suffers, because I think of suffering as a mental state. And people have lots of different views about what consciousness is, but my personal view is it's a pattern of computational processing that's evolved in our heads, whatever it is, right? But there's something about, there's a difference for me between, the atmosphere being polluted and me pinching the back of my hand, right? The latter feels like something I can suffer. And I don't think the atmosphere can suffer through being polluted, even though that might be bad for all of the sentient beings it impacts.
Yes. I respectfully disagree.
Yeah. Okay.
In that I don't think suffering should be limited to conscious beings, for the same reason as if a human is unconscious, it doesn't mean we can do whatever we want to that body. I don't think there should be a relationship between those two things. I think in terms of suffering is it cannot flourish. So if it's not flourishing, it's suffering. And so actually and also because the whole of the natural world is connected, that actually if we pollute the atmosphere, if we, poison our seas, then that's going to have an impact on living beings, on fish and on birds. And then that's going to have an impact on humans. And so actually, because the whole of life is interconnected, if one part suffers, the whole part suffers. That's a biblical reference, and it's so true. And so I do see that the natural world can suffer. And we can see that, the reality with Mother Nature, though, is that she will always win. So if we are attacking her, if we are destroying her, she'll fight back. That's not going to be great, because if Mother Nature fights back, then actually humans cannot survive or flourish. And so I think because we're all interconnected, if one part suffers, they all suffer, then my morality has to take into consideration the suffering of all humans, all animals, all living things. Having said that, I actually find it harder to... There are certain human beings I find incredibly difficult. I don't know how to put this without sounding really horrible. There are some people that I don't count in my moral considerations, because I think sometimes they cause so much suffering. I find it very, very hard to want them to flourish. And so, I even just on a very personal day-to-day, all of it, the ideas we're talking about at the moment are very up in the sky. Day-to-day, if someone says something to me that I find abhorrent, I find it incredibly difficult to want them to flourish in that moment and to feel respected. And so I can get very passionate. I get my high horse. I can get very judgmental if people have racist, homophobic, exclusive, transphobic, whatever views, anti-poor, pro-rich. There are lots of views I find abhorrent, and they're the people I find hard. Whereas actually looking after the trees, I'm like, yeah, I'm good with that.
I'm with you. And to take those backwards, I think that's one of the hardest things about commitment to universal compassion is it means having moral consideration, even for people that annoy us on Twitter, and even for people that commit egregious harms. And I think this is one of the things that I quite often talk about with compassion, because some people will challenge compassion, which in simple terms is not wanting others to suffer and wanting them to flourish in their own terms, is that it doesn't imply weakness or appeasement, or you just sort of roll over and let people do what they want. You can, if someone is causing harm or has deeply harmful views, or is... One, you need to have compassion for the people that they are impacting negatively, and that can justify you constraining, harming, or even in extremis, killing other humans, right? If I see someone with a machete running towards a school bus, and you have a chance to stop them by killing them, most people would say, yeah, let's do that, right? I would still say technically I would be including that person in my moral consideration, because I wouldn't want to... The only thing I want to do is prevent them from causing harm, even if that harms them. But I wouldn't want to cause them harm over and above that. I wouldn't want to then lock them away and torture them, or, there's still a moral consideration there. They still count, even though I think they're evil or dangerous and need to be dealt with in some, maybe even a brutal way. So that's the way I try and maintain at least a technical moral consideration for them. I haven't excluded them, but I still retain the motivation to punish, challenge, constrain, whatever it is.
I would agree. I remember once, years ago, I was working in a school in Colchester. Colchester kind of school for girls, so shout out if anyone's listening. And a student there asked me, is there anything you believe is absolutely wrong? And I was like, goodness me, that's one of the best questions I've ever been asked. And I said, abuse of power. I think anybody who has any amount of power and they use that to cause suffering to other people, or they abuse that power, I think that is always wrong. There is never a time. I think everything else, killing could be right in certain situations, lying could be right in certain situations. There is never a time where abuse of power is okay. And I think whether you are a church, whether you are a teacher, whether you are a husband or wife, whether you are a parent, if you abuse the power that you have, it is always wrong.
Whereas most other things, you can at least technically imagine some justification.
Justification, for example, shooting the man that's about to shoot a class of kids like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, these thought experiments are often quite unpleasant. Let's leave that one there. I want to come back to your thoughts about on the environment, because many people share that sort of stance. And it's actually one of the first times that the word sentientism was used was to criticize the idea. And it was people who have a biocentric or an ecocentric stance who said, look, sentientism in a way is discriminating against the non-sentient stuff, the things that can't suffer. But you took a slightly different tack, because in a way you're not saying, well, I'm discriminating or I'm excluding insentient things. You're saying that in a way, things I think aren't sentient, you think are sentient, because it's not an aspect of consciousness. You think an environment or an atmosphere or a river can actually suffer. So in that sense, you're including them in your sentientism because you see they are sentient. Now, in a way, I would share a lot of that sense of interconnectedness with those things. The reason I care deeply about the environment is maybe a bit more instrumental than you, whereas you would care directly about them because you think the atmosphere can suffer. I would care about the atmosphere because of its impact on the quadrillion of sentient beings, human and non-human, that
for me,
live on this earth.
It's both of them.
Whereas for you, it's both.
Yeah. But also what I do want to just say is that, this middle way idea that I get from Buddhism is that I still have to exist within this world. I do not believe in extremism. I think if you take any idea to its extreme, it becomes destructive. And so, I'm not going to wear a mask so I don't hurt bacteria. I'm not going to sweep the path so I don't accidentally tread on an ant. You have to be balanced in these things and take that middle way. And I think, very, very crudely, you've got a use of the environment and abuse of the environment. If I cut down a tree to make a house, I'm using the environment, but it's completely necessary. All right. I don't believe that a tree is sentient and that if I burn it to keep warm, it's hurting. That at all. If I, cause deforestation, then actually that is wrong. And so, deforestation has to be counted as something which is immoral because it's abusing.
Yeah, but it's not because the trees are feeling.
It's not because the trees going, that really hurts.
Yeah.
It's not that kind of consciousness suffering. It's seeing the universe or seeing our earth as, it's a closed system that we are part of. We are allowed to use it. We're allowed to cut down trees. We're allowed to breathe in bacteria. We can accidentally tread on an ant. We're okay with doing this. And actually, I drive a car. It's an unleaded car. It's not electric. And I drive half an hour to school and back every day. I want to limit the impact that I'm having on the environment, but not to the fact that it's an extreme. Because again, the end or purpose is about the survival and flourishing of human life. And what do I need to create that? I don't do anything that's unnecessary.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so while you'd see, when you talk about the atmosphere suffering or flourishing, I get the sense that that's more in the context of the atmosphere playing a role in the broader Earth's ecosystem that enables the good lives of sentient beings, rather than it being an abstract thing. So, for example, if we let climate change go completely nuts on Earth and, there's widespread extinction and there's a ratchet effect and a spin-off effect, we'll essentially end up like Venus, right, which is 450 degrees centigrade and whatever. But you don't look at Venus and think Venus's atmosphere is suffering, there's something wrong, nature's fighting back, right? That's just a different planet. The reason you use the term flourishing in the context of our atmosphere is because it is so important to the interdependent lives of all the sentient beings. Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, and that leads us. The other thing I wanted to touch on in this topic is that one of the dangers with a pure ecocentric stance, which does almost do what I was suggesting, which says, look, the environment, independent of the sentient beings, has its own moral worth, such that someone would look at the environment on Mars and go, that matters morally, even though it has zero impact on sentient beings. In a way, I don't sort of mind if people want to go beyond sentient beings, but the risk often is with a sort of ethical flattening where people go to the point of saying, well, human beings matter, sentient animals matter, plants and fungi matters, rocks, rivers, trees, ecosystems, and the earth has Gaia all matter. In a way, everything matters, but because we need to live, there's no moral difference between pushing a knife into a pig and pushing a knife into a carrot, because everything matters. And that's where the alarm bells start to go off.
Yeah, and I don't think that, because I think we have to eat. So
and because, as you said, the carrot isn't feeling pain and the pig is. So there is still there's a real difference there that I'm really keen we don't lose that distinction.
No, we don't need to eat pigs to survive. We do need to eat to survive. The only way we can eat is to use nature. And it's about choosing what part of nature do we take so that everything can flourish and survive. If we grow a carrot and eat it, there's no resultant suffering at all. It's what nature was designed to do. Nature was designed to feed us and allow us to survive. If we kill pigs, it causes suffering and it's unnecessary.
So, and we have to feed loads of carrots to pigs.
Yeah.
Let's not get into feed conversion ratios and land use and so on. But yeah. No, thank you. That's so. The other thing you touched on in this context is that you mentioned you don't eat meat, and I think you're on a sort of journey towards veganism, partly for that, for those concerns. What's that journey been like for you? Because this is a really interesting shift. Because from my perspective, I was vegetarian in my sort of early mid-20s, basically for animal ethics reasons, which haven't changed to today. But there was something so visceral about putting a piece of animal that once was sentient in my body that made that a very visceral and actually quite a socially manageable thing to give up at that time. Whereas at that point, going vegan and giving up on egg products and dairy and whatever else felt socially like a step too far. And because you're not actually putting a piece of the animal in your body, it felt like it was another few steps removed. But I guess the interesting thing is I look back on that journey, and it's never complete, because just because someone's vegan doesn't mean they've reached some state of ethical purity. You basically can't live without causing some harm, as you were saying, right? We have to live, and there's all sorts of incidental harms that we cause, however well we think we're doing. But as I've gone through that journey, it's been interesting because I think there's been a shift in my own mind where a lot of the decisions were really very much about me and social acceptability and maybe senses of disgust and senses of involvement. And a deeper shift that's taken longer to come through has been trying to put that stuff to one side and more thinking from the perspective of the non-human animals that are being farmed. So it's shifted away from being a thought about what should I buy and what are the products and so on, to thinking about the ethics of how those things are produced and the processes and the farming processes and what that implies for the sentient beings that are going through it, which has sort of led me to a slightly purer ethical stance. But my motivation shifted as I've gone through that journey. But I should stop rambling on because I'm supposed to be interviewing you. But I'm interested in what your journey's been like on that. How challenging has it been, and where have you got to, and what's the response been from, again, family, friends, and others around you? Because you're butting up against a pretty strong social norm there.
Yeah, I mean, I there's not a single part of me that cares what anyone thinks. That's the reality.
Yeah, it's a helpful start.
I just don't care. And there's a lot of extremist vegans out there that I think are unhelpful. And I think people that eat meat use those as a reason to eat meat. So I think they need to shush and stop.
And is that because it becomes a sort of polarizing tribal label thing, and also there's an implication that it's a purity thing?
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things where it's like you have to give up meat or you're a bad person, and I think there's a lot of guilt trips and all this kind of stuff. And I just don't think that is helpful in this conversation. I think, so that's the first thing I'd say. If you take things to extremes, if you eat meat and you do intensive farming, it's wrong. If you grow your own, have your own chickens and take their eggs and then kill it, eat it. It's a very sustainable way of surviving. I'm okay with people doing that. My children eat meat. It's not up to me to decide their morality. This is something that I've decided is the right thing for me based on my knowledge and experience. But for the first 35 years of my life, I ate meat. And so therefore it'd be completely hypocritical for me to say to someone else, well, you're not allowed to, just because I've decided not to based on my experience.
And how does that relate to some forms of intrahuman ethics? Because there is an interesting dynamic here where I think there's something about, for example, food choices and non-human animal ethics, where there is this sense that it's just a personal choice and I don't have the right to judge others, which we don't apply in intra-human ethics. Because if someone else is being homophobic or sexist, we're quite comfortable saying, well, what you're doing is causing harm. It's needless harm.
But I think there's a difference between not agreeing with homosexuality and being homophobic. The two don't go hand in hand. In the same way, it's okay to, if someone decides to eat meat, but actually makes someone else eat meat, or judges someone for being a vegetarian, or is part of a process of intensive harm or whatever. I think there's degrees of things. And I think everybody is on their own journey towards what they think is the right thing to do. I don't think it's helpful to try and take someone else to a place where they're not ready to go to yet. I think we've got to be compassionate to where people are, their experiences, their knowledge, their context, that generally people are trying to do the right thing. And, I am not a perfect person. I know that drinking milk from a cow causes as much suffering as eating beef. I don't eat beef, but I do drink cow's milk. And so there is an inherent contradiction in my own morality, because I'm human and actually I'm trying to exist day by day and make it as simple as possible. For me, giving up meat was easy, ridiculously easy. If it had been hard, I don't know if I'd have done it. So I think there's these idealistic morals that I have, and then there's reality of day-to-day life. So therefore, I must be compassionate to where other people are. The reason I became, do you know what? It was interesting. I wanted to become a vegetarian for a long time, but I really, really loved meat. And I knew that if I became a vegetarian, I wouldn't be able to eat it. And that was as far as I got. But
yeah, I know that feeling. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was like, I know where this is going to go. If I let logic take me. Yeah.
Yes, I know what this means. So I think that for me, it was environmental. It was the environmental cost of eating meat before it was about the suffering of animals.
Yeah. Seeing them as another whose experiences matter.
100%. It was, and actually that was selfish. That was, we have to look after this planet because it's our home. And therefore I know that eating meat is the worst thing we can do for the environment. It causes the most deforestation, the most air and sea pollution. It's just devastating. And this is my planet. And I have children, and I want my children to have children that live on a planet that helps them to flourish.
Yeah. And if animal agriculture didn't exist today, creating it would be one of the most insane things anyone would ever suggest. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that there was too many overwhelming reasons not to eat meat. I didn't need it. It didn't offer me anything nutritionally that I couldn't get anywhere else. It was destroying our atmosphere. Then you think about the suffering of animals. Then you think about not just eating animals, but the processes around it, these intensive farmings and just horrendous way that we treat animals that we use. It was overwhelming that this was not the right thing for me to do as a human being. But it wasn't until a student said to me, they owned me. We were doing a lesson on peace and conflict, and they said to me, "Miss, are you a pacifist?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Do you eat meat?" I said, "Yes." They said, "Then you're not a pacifist." I was like, oh no.
I might have to use
and
that.
Was it. That was it. That was the last sort of piece of the puzzle. And it happened to be on Ash Wednesday. And while I'm not religious, I was like, do you know what? Because you've just said this to me, you've totally destroyed me. I am going to give up meat for Lent.
What was their reaction to that?
And they were like, well, they were teenagers, so they were kind of cool about it. But for me, it was a very important moment. They've probably forgotten it, but it's life-changing for me. For 6 weeks, I didn't eat meat. At no point did I miss it. It was the easiest transition I'd ever made. And then I haven't looked back since. I just haven't. What I've done in terms of, veganism is I am probably 99% vegan. But because I believe in the middle way, because I don't like taking things to extremes, I think that I have to sometimes weigh up the cost to my life emotionally, whatever it might be, and the impact that me having some milk in my tea in the morning, if I'm having a bit of a low day, the impact for me is justifiable. So I very rarely have any dairy products, but occasionally I do, because actually the greater good in that situation. If everybody cut down, if everybody had a meat-free day, if everybody cut down on the amount of meat that they had, or they had a meat-free, the impact that would have on the environment is huge. And I think sometimes people feel they have to do something extreme for it to be worth it. Like exercise, I've got to run a marathon. No, just walk around the block once a day. Just do something that's manageable and maintainable that will have a positive impact. And so I'm all about the middle way. In all honesty, don't think there'll ever be a time where I'm 100% vegan. I feel very happy that I am doing the least amount possible that is causing harm to other living beings.
Yeah, we'll see if we can tip you over the edge. but I think, and I'm at risk of doing what I don't think it's useful to, audit each other on this stuff at all. It's more interested in the personal journey, because I think for me, where I've got to is, I think it is important to, think through the theory and the intellectual stuff about the ethical pull and recognizing non-human sentient beings as moral patients in their own right, and seeing with clear eyes, as I think you do, what the reality of farming is, for example, is like for them, or the reality of research or various other forms of animal exploitation as well. And not, dodging that stuff, seeing it with clear eyes and open eyes. The most supposedly humane farm, the animals are still treated in brutal ways and end up in the same slaughterhouses. So, but at the same time, I agree that if we try and present this as some sort of pure, perfect ethical stance that everybody has to reach now, just in practical terms, that's not a particularly compelling message for people. And if we do have a universal compassion for each other, even people we disagree with, both tactically in terms of, making things better for non-human animals and other humans and the environment, and out of compassion, I think it is better to engage with compassion and understanding, and remember the journeys we're all still on, and and do that in a good faith way, and just keep trying to all get better. So yeah, there's many echoes there. Thank you. So in the time we've got left, I'm going to ask you one more crazily big question, which is, how do we make a better future? Now, you can answer this in any way you like, sort of grand utopian visions, but it would be fascinating to maybe, as part of that, zero in the work you do, which, as I've said, is teaching future generations about worldviews. And one of the things I've loved about listening to the RE podcast and engaging with many of the people in the RE world is, I'm sure there are more conservative people out there, or maybe more reactionary people who, wish it could be more narrowly focused on a religion and their religion, and they sort of have fond memories of how RE used to be in the 50s. I'm sure there are plenty of those people. But the people I've engaged with and listening to the people you talk to on the RE podcast, I've been sort of blown away by the open-mindedness and the progressiveness of the stance, in that some of the themes that come through from you and your guests and the other people I've spoken to in the world really want kids to be able to come away with critical thinking skills, with a deep appreciation for the diversity of each other's worldviews as we try and live together in, excitingly mixed communities. And the kids have the skills and the freedom to find their own path through these things as well, and work out what they think and what they believe and what's important to them and how to find meaning in the world. And I just love all that stuff, and it ticks all the boxes. So in that context, what role do you think RE or PSHE or philosophy or religion and worldviews teaching can play in helping us make a better future? And how optimistic do you feel about the role it can play?
I believe that I plant seeds. I never see the finished product of the children that I teach. And sometimes I'll have conversation and it feels like nothing I'm saying is going in, and they're still bigoted or closed-minded or, immoral. But I have to remember I plant seeds, and I'm part of a bigger part of their life. I'm just one little segment. I cannot change lives. I am not going to change lives. I am part of a process. And so if I tell them something and they disagree with me, that little seed is in their mind. And then someone else is going to come along and say something, and it's kind of, oh, they've said this. I remember my teacher said something like that. And then they have an experience here and they're like, oh, they've learnt this. And that's like watering that little seed. And very slowly, over decades, things start to change. And I think in answer to your question, how do you make a better tomorrow? Very slowly. I think sometimes we want change to happen too quickly, and that's not how nature works. That's not how humans work. Things change very, very slowly. And so sometimes it is taking that step back and going, I'm just planting a seed. I'm not dealing with the finished product. I'm dealing with a child. And I'm part of their socialization, and I'm part of their awakening. I'm part of their enlightenment. I'm not all of it. I heard a phrase, a little shout out to Sarah Lane Court, who's the CEO of the Religious Education Council. And she used this phrase in an interview about respectful curiosity. That's how we make a better tomorrow, is we are curious about what other people think and why they think it. And we are curious in a very respectful way. And I think that's is kind of a little bit of what we've lost. I think in the past, we didn't have any curiosity. We just accepted what we were told. And now we are aggressively curious. I think what we need to have is respectful curiosity. And I think that's what RE teaches young people, is to be curious about the world around them, to ask questions, not necessarily agree. You know, this is not religious instruction. We're not telling them what to think. We're telling them how to think. And if we can model in the conversations we have, in the way that we present ideas to them, respectful curiosity, I think because of, as I was saying right at the beginning, children are naturally curious anyway. I bring in the respectful curiosity. But what I think sometimes we do with children is we dampen their curiosity. We don't allow them to ask questions. And actually, I don't just teach RE, I teach PSHE as well. So I'm dealing with gender identity, sexuality, extremism, radicalization, you know, all of these very controversial topics. And actually what's so lovely is the questions children ask when they go, yes, I don't want this to sound bad, but, and then they ask me a question that could sound homophobic or could sound transphobic, but actually they've said it in a way that's like, I genuinely want to know the answer to this, because this is going to help me to embrace things that are changing at a different, that I don't understand, in a way that's not scaring me. So respectful curiosity.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you. Now, one of the things I think you're great at, the RE podcast and your conversations, and I think broadly the RE community is great at, is finding areas of common ground across diversity, you know, finding those things like the golden rule or the platinum rule and ideas of universal compassion and caring for each other and respect that run through. And I think in almost every type of religion, that many people are totally on board with that. So you can look at different religious communities that actually incorporate curiosity and intellectual exploration and analysis as part of their way of being in the world, and respect for other worldviews, religious or not, is part of their religious plurality as well. And allowing people to find their own way is something that people are comfortable to. And you can find that in almost every different form of religion. But there are also forms of most of those religion that can be more fundamentalist. And I'm interested in how you handle that, because in a way there are worldviews and versions of worldviews that actually go against the idea of respectful curiosity, because they might say, for example, I don't want you to be curious. Here is the right answer. You just must believe. And curiosity is a dangerous thing. And not only will you not be respected if you follow curiosity and take a different path, but you may even be punished. I mean, you yourself experienced a version of what some might call shunning, right? So, and that can form a bunch of different ways. One is the epistemology, right? You know, I don't want you to have curiosity. I want you to have faith or follow the authority or read the book. That's the answer. End of story. Some of it can be about the morality and ethics. So instead of it being respect, it can be, you know, they're in the out group, they're going to hell. You know, they're homosexual, they're going to hell. You know, the list goes on. They're in a different caste. You know, they're untouchable, so on and so forth. And defining your own path thing can be difficult as well, because sometimes, you know, finding your own path is seen as a deep, horrific mistake that will end up with you being punished in this life and the next. So again, there's so much there, right? But hopefully you get the general point. How do you cope with teaching people about the more fundamentalist versions of religious worldviews that actually go against the respectful curiosity you're trying to instill? How do you handle that stuff?
Yeah, I think the reality is that we try to avoid those most extremists because they're so extreme and they're so minimal, they're so insignificant as to the whole. The thing that we do is we show variety within a religion. And so part of the worldviews approach in RE, it's not just about teaching non-religious worldviews. That's just that we've done that forever. For the last 50 years, we've been teaching religious, non-religious worldviews. Worldviews is an approach saying that there is variety of religion and belief out there between religions, between religion and non-religion, and within religion. And sometimes it's just as simple as saying some Christians, other Christians. But we're not going to go and talk about, fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints. That's not what Mormonism is. It's a very fundamentalist extreme view and doesn't really reflect anything that's meaningful or significant. So we don't talk about it. We talk about difficult issues, but we don't talk about difficult people. And so it's really important that you make it, opinion-based, not personal. And so, we will have children that will ask questions. Okay, this is a good example. So I was talking about Muslim prayer, and I was saying one thing they say is Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest. And you could see them going, oh, Miss, are you allowed to say that? I was like, yeah, isn't that like about, and so you can guide misconceptions. Go, no, Allahu Akbar is one of the 99 names of Allah. It's recited during prayer. It has been misappropriated by extremist Muslims, but they're not Muslims because the word Muslim means peace, one who submits to the will of Allah. They are not Muslim. And then you move on. So you answer questions. If there's curiosity, you don't dwell, and you certainly don't teach those extremes. But you do teach that there are a variety of views. Some and other are two powerful words. Some Christians, other Christians. And so I think there's definitely like a language shift, is that we don't ever say Christians think this. There's very little that all Christians agree on. And so if there isn't agreement within Christianity, then it's okay that there's not always agreement between Muslims and Christians, but actually, fundamentally, there's more that unites us than divides us. And it's about finding those things.
So it's not just about diversity of different worldviews, it's diversity within the worldviews.
Within the worldviews, absolutely. This is a very good one, as a lot of people think that Buddhists don't believe in God, Christians believe in one God, Hindus believe in many gods. Actually, it's not that at all, that there are gods within Buddhism, so we can't call it an atheistic religion. And Hindus believe in one ultimate being called Brahman, who has avatars in the same way as Allah has 99 names, and God is, merciful and gracious, and that actually there's similarities between those beliefs. They're not these distinct little beliefs in completely separate boxes. And so the messy bit of RE, that's the bit that we love, when it doesn't fit into those neat boxes. And I always say to my children, I hope you leave my lesson slightly more confused than when you walked in. If so, I've done my job.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you. And is that approach also how you manage the risk of respect turning into a relativism? Because respect sounds nice, but if you then respect all views, including the extreme ones, it can lead to a relativism where you say, well, some people think this, some people think that. Who are we to judge? Maybe homophobia is completely appropriate, but it sounds like that's how you manage that boundary of, you can respect the commonality and the stances that don't cause harm, but you're still comfortable drawing a line somewhere where you...
Yeah. I think there are controversial issues. I teach homosexuality. I have to teach that some Christians believe it is an abomination. I have to teach that. But one thing that we do is we don't leave those things there. They then have to make, certainly in GCSE and A-level, they have to make a judgment. They have to practice critical realism, in that there has to be some wrongs, but there's more than one right. So you can have pluralism and absolutism side by side. It's the same as the elephant. Two extreme things, opposite things, can both exist. There are wrongs, but there's more than one right. And it's teaching children how to distinguish between those things. And so we teach them how to make judgments on moral issues. How do you decide what is right and wrong? How do you decide what a strong or a weak argument is? And actually giving them those skills, giving them that framework, allows them to think for themselves, not being told what to think.
Yeah, it's the toolkit, not the answer.
It's the toolkit.
Yeah.
And I always say we teach them how to think, not what to think. If I teach them what different people think and then how to make those judgments of what's right and wrong and bring in their own personal worldview, that actually, what do you think? Why do you think it? What caused you to think that? So they're starting to apply that critical realism to their own worldview as well. I'm giving them the tools to know how to make decisions in the future. I would never want to disrespect religion, but I have to critique it. And I think sometimes they get conflated.
Yeah, thank you. Now, just to wrap up, if you we've already had about, I think, 17 education ministers in the UK in the past 10 years. So if you were to be the next one, or let's take it to another level, if you were to be education minister globally, which takes it to a whole new level given the cultural and the religious diversity around the world, but you had a hand in shaping the education, kids globally got to have around these topics of worldviews, religion and philosophy, what would you like to see if you could wave that magic wand?
I take out exams. I just think, that would make such a fundamental difference because of the parameters which you are forced into to teach to an exam syllabus.
Yeah, because you want to teach kids how to think, not what to think, but they need to know what to put in the exam. So that's the what.
Yeah. And I think that it's not what education is. I don't think education is testing, so I think I would never want to be an education minister, ever. I would never want to do that. I really wish, I hope and pray to an invisible, invisible, real, unreal God, to the universe. Can we have an education minister that has come from education, that has been a teacher, that's been a head teacher, that has had that lived experience? Because I think that our education ministers are doing their best, bless them. I'm not going to criticize them, but they don't know what they're doing. They don't understand schools. They don't understand education. They don't understand what's going on in the classroom. They are basing it on their own very, very narrow experience of education 30 years ago. What is going on in classrooms right now is so fundamentally different, and they're making policies based on the past, not based on the present. So actually, I would not take on that role. My one change would be to get rid of testing, exams, and actually what I'd want is to see somebody in there that has experience.
Yeah, thank you. And would you put Sentientism on the curricula? As another worldview. Not that I'm biased at all.
Yeah. I think the reality is that, we want to, again, we want to teach children how to think, not what to think. If we teach them how to think, we're doing a naturalistic approach. Anyway, it's a fundamental, it underpins everything we do. We cannot teach every religion and every worldview. We have to be selective. And I don't want to teach every religion and worldview in a cursory one lesson on this, because I think it's doing a disservice. What I want to do is make them get deep into ideas, concepts, and thinking skills. I don't think it matters what the stuff is, really. Whether, I don't think we have to teach every, the 6 big religions and a non-religious point of view. I think we've got to think what we want to teach children how to think. And then if they come in contact with a worldview that's different from their own, then they can practice that respectful curiosity. Education is not the end of their education. School is not the end of their education. We've got to give them the tools to continue to be educated.
Like you say, you're just planting the seeds. And I get that sense, again, as an amateur looking from the outside, there are criticisms of the current RE world about maybe lacking depth, but the depth that people want, and I think the depth kids need, isn't let's go deeper into a specific worldview or a specific religion and, really understand the rituals or really understand, X, Y, Z. The depth is about the themes and the philosophies and the epistemology and the ethics.
It's absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And in a way, that's, it's my biased pitch for Sentientism, is because that's exactly what Sentientism is about. It doesn't have the rituals or the cultural stuff or the history or the buildings to visit. All it has is the epistemology and it has the ethics, which I think it just fits into those themes. You'd have to call it sentientism. It's those deep themes of epistemology and ethics that I think resonate. And my final question, you spend so much time with future generations. Are the kids going to save us? Are we going to be okay?
Yeah, I don't think this at all. I don't ever think that, that this generation is terrible and it's all going to fall down, or these are our savior. I think they will do very similar to what we've done. They'll get some bits right, they'll get some bits wrong. Society will improve in one way and it will get worse in others. I think we somehow have this very strange idea that we are constantly getting better. I think we're just constantly changing and evolving, and there's not necessarily a better or worse. We look back at our childhood and go, life was better without phones. We were outside playing. But actually, our children are much more aware because they have the internet and phones. So I think that the reality is that our future will be better in some ways and worse in others. And the future generation will do some great things and they will make some fundamental mistakes, because that is the pattern of society. And every generation has done some great things and has done some terrible things. And that's what's going to continue to happen in the future.
Just how humanity works. Yeah. Thank you. Well, I'm going to let you go. Is there anything else you wanted to add into the conversation? I mean, we've answered what's real, what matters, who matters, and how to make a better future in 90 minutes. So it's pretty good after a long, hard day at school that you've already had. So anything else you wanted to add in? But also, how can people follow you, subscribe to the podcast, keep up to date with your social media and so on? I'll include links in the show notes, of course. But.
Yes. So the podcast is called The RE Podcast. So I have a website, www.therepodcast.co.uk, and you can follow me on the Twitter at the RE Podcast 1, because I'm the first one, and on Instagram and LinkedIn, all Facebook, anything. Just come and follow me. If you go to my website, there's a get in touch page. I'm always up for a question or a suggestion or a thought. People can get in touch. So that's probably it. An episode on Sentientism with Jamie Woodhouse coming soon.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm not sure. I'm quite uncomfortable even after all this, listening back to myself. I will look forward to it and see how I did.
Yeah. Oh, it was fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. It's a delightful episode.
Well, it's been a genuine pleasure to talk to you. Thank you again to you and all of your RE colleagues for doing amazing, deeply thought through, important work. And it's been a pleasure to have you on Sentientism as a guest. Thank you, Louisa.
Jamie, thank you for the great questions and letting me geek out on the stuff I love best.
Brilliant. All right. Have a good evening. Please do stay in touch.
I will do. Take care.
Take care.